pleasure, or good morning, as you said, or maybe good evening. Who knows, wherever you are. But we're very happy to be able to be with you today, and we'd like to really begin by saying that we know that in most places anyway, you're either beginning or you have just begun a new school year. And so what does this new school year mean in terms of how we might develop our students in a way that helps them to become more self-directed in their learning? We know that many of us throughout the world are saying right now that one of the problems that we have is that we have students who are waiting in a sense to be rescued from learning. They raise their hands. Can you help me? Can you tell me what to do? How many pages? How many more do I have to do before I'm done? It's kind of like school has become a series of tasks rather than a wonderful opportunity for learning and innovating and finding out about new things and new knowledge. Well, how do we help our students so that they are more encouraged, excited, more curious about the work that they do? Art Costa and I have worked hard to think about these questions, and we've kind of decided that there's a set of habits that students can have. And what we're going to do is talk with you about those habits so that as you launch your new school year, or the school year as it's being launched, that you make certain that you're putting these habits and the way that you work with these habits into the bank for your classroom so that students will become more self-engaged, self-directed, and motivated for learning. So with that in mind, Art, let's take a poll. I guess the first question we have is, what is your role in the school? Who are you? We need to know just a little bit more about you. Where are you coming from, and what is your role in the school? So if you could answer the first poll for us we're asking who you are, and we're beginning to see now that we have many classroom teachers. Bravo. We have administrators. We have professional development leaders, pre-service teachers, and of course there's always that other category, and we just have to wonder what the other is. But you could certainly chat with us and tell us who you are. If you're not already in here, you might just say, here's who I am as an other, so we would know. But it looks like approximately half are our classroom teachers. And then, of course, we have the other people who are concerned with this question. So, Art, why don't we talk a little bit about the essential questions that we have?
In this program, we'd like to respond to two essential questions. And the first one is, what are the essential characteristics of effective, creative, successful 21st century problem solvers? And the reason why this is important is because your students are going to be growing up in a very different era than the one in which we are living, or the one that we are used to. And so we have to think about the future. What are the kinds of problems that they're going to be solving? And you have but to look around you and see problems in the environment, problems with the economy, problems with social unrest, problems with terrorism. These are the types of problems that your students are going to be facing in their future. And then, of course, what are the characteristics of the people who will be able to solve those problems in successful ways? So we'd like to focus on those today. And then secondly, we want students not only to be good problem solvers, but we want them to be self-initiating and self-directed as well. We don't want to have them depend upon someone else to solve problems for them. Rather, we want them to be able to solve problems, to approach problems without prompting and with a plan of action in mind. And so we have then some new 3 R's for our students. One of them is being ready for school, the other, ready for learning, and of course, ready for life. Now, what do we mean by those 3 R's? First of all, ready for school means that they're able to demonstrate their knowledge of mastery of the standards and the Common Core competencies that they're focusing in our curriculum today. And such tests that the students will be taking will disclose whether students are able to manage the learning tasks that you provide for them. The test will give teachers some early signals as to which students need assistance and which students need more advanced and complex challenges. When we say ready for learning, how do you know when your students have really learned a concept? Can they explain it to others, for example? Can they give examples from their own experience? Can they ask further, more complex questions about it? Can they make predictions? Can they take alternative points of view and empathize with others who may understand those particular concepts? And can they apply it in other situations beyond that in which it was learned? So first of all, we want students ready for school, and then, of course, ready for learning. But even beyond that, we want them to be ready for life. Remember that you're not only preparing students to be successful in school, you also want them to be successful in their life throughout the 21st and maybe into the 22nd centuries, particularly if you are a primary grades teacher, your kids are going to be living well beyond the 21st century. And this requires them to be critical and creative thinkers, to meet the unknown problems that face them, and to be able to look at the world problems because we are increasingly becoming globalized. It means being able to work collaboratively with others, and it means continuing to love learning throughout their lifetimes. Sometimes we say, are we preparing students not only for a life of tests, but also for the tests of life?
What a challenge for us all. What a challenge to make certain in this very uncertain time that we're helping our students to think deeply, to be more engaged with the big ideas, as Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe would say, and to be able to really think, be thoughtful about what it is that they're learning. So much of our lives today are in a quick fix, kind of easy, quick gratification, and we're suggesting that maybe we need to take some more time to be prepared for taking all the information that we're getting and making sense out of it. And at the core of the Common Core standards is that sense-making requirement. It's basically saying we need to encourage our students to be better thinkers. If you look at the Common Core standards, you will see so much of them are designed. And here we have on this slide actual quotations from some of the Common Core. For example, they're asking us comprehend and evaluate complex texts. So now we're saying it's not enough for you to just tell us you saw it, you read it, you understood it. But now we want to know, can you also evaluate that material? What do you really think about this now that you're better informed? How do you evaluate its importance, its worthiness? And then we're also asking you to independently discern. Now that's interesting to me because I've always believed that one of the adverbs that's been missing from all of our standards is the adverb independently. It's wonderful to be able to tell kids what we want them to do, but it's also equally important that they can do it without our continuously reminding them, telling them what we're expecting. So without prompting. And then, finally, directly from the Common Core standards, that they become self-directed learners. So we were wondering, how familiar are you with the new Common Core standards, since most of our states will be addressing that, and plus, they certainly reference for independent schools, for international schools, they certainly reference the kinds of standards that we're all really paying attention to. So we notice now that even though there's only 8% or so people for whom it does not apply, but it applies anyway because most states are really looking at this as a central set of attributes for students to comprehend, to evaluate, to be more independent without prompting. And as we see this poll coming in, we see that although 28% are not yet involved, 67% are familiar now. And of course, we have until 2014 for most states to really get in gear and to be paying attention to this full scale. But how wonderful that we're getting prepared for these Common Core standards, these standards that have deeper meaning and are really pushing our students to be more independent and more self-directed as learners. Art, why don't you talk a bit about what we mean when we say habits of mind? Like if we want these attributes to be apparent for our students and for them to become more self-directed, what do we really mean when we say a habit of mind?
Yeah, when we talk about habits of mind, what we're talking about is a disposition. Dispositions that are skillfully and mindfully employed by intelligent, successful people when they're confronted with problems, the solutions to which are not immediately apparent. Now, you have, as a handout or a download, an article entitled Habits of Mind. And you get a chance to review these. We hope that you will look at the winning habits of mind described. Now, that doesn't mean that that's all the habits of mind there are, but we've identified 16, and that seems to be enough to think about. Basically, what these are the attributes or the dispositions of successful people from many walks of life. We looked at entrepreneurs and salespeople and artists and physicians and teachers and auto mechanics, and we said, what is it about these people that make them such effective problem solvers? And I began to identify these habits of mind. And what we're suggesting is that if these are the habits of successful people, then if we teach these to students, they too will be successful in their future. When we talk about habits of mind, we're talking about such skills as persisting, for example. In fact, you might want to think about your kids. Do they give up easily? As they're working along on a problem, do they all of a sudden say, I can't do this, it's too hard? Well, that's not quite good enough. We want people who are able to stick to a task over time and have the strategies and the inclination to stick to it and see it through to completion. We're talking about people who manage their impulsivity. Do your students blurt out in class? Do your students giggle at each other? Well, people who manage their impulsivity are able to listen, to understand others, to withhold judgment. We want our students to think before they act. Another habit of mind is striving for accuracy. Do your students did papers and they've not bothered to check them over, for example? They lack that desire for craftsmanship and precision. Well, we want people who are able to strive for accuracy, who want precision, and who want to make sure that they're correct. We want people who are wondrous. Do your students ever say, who cares? That's dumb. It's boring. Well, that's not quite good enough. We want students who are intrigued, who are wondrous, and who are able to continue learning throughout their lifetime. And so these are the attributes, some of the attributes of people who are successful, and what we're suggesting is that these are the attributes that they're going to need as they confront the problems of the 21st century and beyond. Now, when we talk about self-directedness, we are basically talking about 3 stages or descriptions of people who are indeed self-directed. And what we mean by that is that they are 1, self-managing, 2, self-monitoring, and 3, self-modifying. What do we mean by self-directed then? Do you have students who say, what am I supposed to do? Do your students have difficulty following directions? Do they look to you for approval? They say, I don't know how to get started. Help me. Do they approach a problem without any kind of a plan of action in mind? They just start doing something. Are they unable to self-evaluate? Do they make the same mistakes over and over rather than learning from their experiences? You must remember that you're not going to be with your students for the rest of their lives. They must become self-directed. And by self-directed, we mean they are self-managing, self-monitoring, and self-modifying. Now, Ben and I would like to explain each of these and relate them to the habits of mind. So what do we mean by self-managing? Basically, a self-managing person is one who approaches a task with a plan of action. They have a clarity of outcomes. They know what they're trying to accomplish. They have some goals in mind. They have a strategic plan. They have gathered data to support their ideas. They've drawn from past experiences because they've experienced problems and plans like this in the past. They anticipate success indicators. What will it look like, or what will it be like if they are successful? So they have a vision in mind. And they have alternatives, so that if one plan doesn't work, another plan is ready to be employed in case the first one doesn't work. You might think about your own role as a teacher, because you have to be self-managing. You plan for instruction, and when you make that plan, you draw on past experience, You have clarity of outcomes. You say, what is my goal here? What am I trying to accomplish in this lesson? What do I know about my students? When have I approached tasks like this in the past? You make an image in your head of what the lesson is going to look like, what questions you're going to be asking, for example, what you're going to do in this lesson. And, of course, you say, if this lesson doesn't work, what's plan B? Where do I back up to? So this is what we mean by self-managing. It's people who put a plan of action in their head before they begin. Now, the habits of mind fit here perfectly, because if you have a management plan in your head, you have managed your impulsivity. It's not the first little plan that comes to mind, but rather you've considered alternatives. You've thought about it. You've thought flexibly. What we mean by that is you thought about the end product in mind, and you've backed up from there. You think about the students and look at it from their point of view. You say, what questions am I trying to answer in this lesson? And you draw forth past knowledge. You have taught lessons like this before, for example. You have experiences like this that you are drawing upon. You have a lot of data that you have generated. You gather data through all of the senses. For example, some of your feelings and some of your intuition. You've observed students, for example. You've listened to them. And so you've gathered a lot of information to put this plan together. And, of course, you've used your creativity by thinking about new and different ways to approach a problem. And so we want students to be able to be self-managing using those habits of mind. And you, of course, as a teacher, use these same habits as you are planning a lesson or any task as far as that goes. Let's take a look now at self-monitoring.
Now, when you're self-monitoring, you're being aware of your own and others' use of thinking skills, and you're monitoring as you go along. You're thinking about what strategies and dispositions and their effects on their environment. So if we think about that in terms of getting a sufficient self-knowledge, what we're really talking about here is that as you go along in your plan, as you begin to think about what you're doing, you also are alert to things that are happening in the moment, and you're willing to modify, to revise, to make certain that you're in fact doing these things and doing them well. So, for example, if you wanted to look at self-monitoring, and this would be true for each of our definitions, you saw that when Art presented the self-managing, and here you'll see it with self-monitoring. It really lends itself, these descriptions lend themselves to the possibility of even developing a rubric for yourself, or a rubric that your students could develop. You might be asking yourself as you were engaged and you were trying to be more self-managing or self-monitoring. So you might say, well, have I actually been conscious of what I'm doing? Am I alert to changes I need to make? And what were the changes I made? And did they work or did they not work? So you're really thinking about modifying your plan as you go along. When you're doing that, of course, you're using one of the most significant intellectual dispositions, which is thinking about your thinking, metacognition. And I think many of you know, because of all the work that's been done around metacognition, how significant it is for students to be aware of their thinking. So as you're self-monitoring, you're really asking yourself, are you aware of what you're doing? And we will delve into this a bit more deeply in a few moments. But we're also asking the question about persisting. Are you persisting? Have you really stayed with it? I hear too often that students try something and then they just give up and they say, I can't do this. Or they say, this is as good as it can be. But we really are asking students, as they become self-monitoring, to ask themselves, what resources do I need? What other ideas might I have? Who might I ask to help me to think this through in a new and different way? How can I stay with it without feeling like I need to always struggle for help? What are the self-help kinds of things that I can do? It's sort of, in a grander sense, it's kind of the thing that we often do in the classroom where we say, ask 3 before me, meaning ask 3 other people in the room before you come and ask me, the teacher. Well, imagine if we had students who were able to think about what are the 3 resources that I could turn to before I try to say, I can't do this. How about monitoring? Monitoring for accuracy and precision. being sure that we do more than just a spell check. We do an information check. We make sure that our references are clear. We try to be as precise as possible in our communicating. And we listen with understanding and empathy. We actually, as we're self-monitoring, we also may seek peer evaluation or peer help. So if I'm in a writing group, for example, I might be a peer editor, and I listen to understand what is this other person trying to say, and am I helping them to be as good as they can possibly be. So when we're self-monitoring, we're also looking for coaching, we're looking for support, we're looking for some way of paying attention and attending to the fact that we are going to pay better attention to the quality of our work before we turn it in.
And this brings us to the last stage, which is self-modifying. And that means learning from our experiences. You know, we go through life sometimes, and we have a lot of experiences, but they don't accumulate into anything. Sometimes students, and we, make the same mistakes again and again without having learned from the experience. So self-modifying basically means reflecting on, evaluating, analyzing, and constructing meaning from the experience and making a commitment to apply that learning to future activities and strategies. So what we mean by self-modifying then is that we learn from our experience, and that means, of course, that we analyze what happened, that we try to say, what did I do that made it work, or what didn't I do that made it not work? It means that we make a commitment to get better at it over time. So based upon this learning, what am I going to do in the future? How might I alter my behavior to make it more effective, to make it more powerful, and to confront problems like this with even greater expertise in the future? And so that brings us then to some of the habits of mind that we can use that are the intellectual dispositions of self-directed learners. For example, it means thinking and communicating with clarity and precision. So as we think about what happened in this experience, what evidence do I have to support these conclusions? How might I communicate these to others and to myself with clarity? Am I really thinking clearly about this? It means responding with wonderment and awe. What will I continue to wonder about as a result of this experience? What intrigued me about it? Rather than just saying, okay, that's over, it's done with, we might ask ourselves, what will I continue to wonder about? What am I going to continue to be curious about as a result of this experience? It means remaining open to continuous learning. There's an openness to say, I want to learn more about this. I am not satisfied. I want to raise the bar. I want to continue to get better at this over time. And so we set some goals for ourselves to continue to learn from this experience. And then, of course, we might think interdependently. For example, who might I turn to help me with this? Who might I talk this over with to get their insights as well? What other people or what other resources can help me to continue to improve, to learn throughout a lifetime? And so self-modifying basically means then that we reflect on our experiences and we try to learn from them. Well, those kind of give us a notion of what we mean by being self-directed. It means, first of all, self-managing, thinking through a task and preparing ourselves for a task before we begin. Self-monitoring basically means that we monitor our progress along the task to make sure that we are on target, that we need to perhaps change and go through some alternatives. It means that we are alert to cues to let us know whether our strategy is working for us or not. And then, when the task is complete, we reflect back on the learning and say, all right, what have I learned from this? What do I need to do to improve? What commitments do I need to make for achieving even more powerful goals in the future?
With that in mind, we thought that maybe this would be a chance for you to catch your breath, kind of digest some of what Art and I are saying, and reflect upon your students. So as you think about your students, what are you observing about them that suggests they need to learn to be more self-directed? What do you see them saying and doing? If you can use the chat feature to send your thoughts to us and to each other, let's just take a few moments for you to kind of digest what we're saying, think about your students, and say what suggests to you, that says to you that they need to be more self-directed.
So some of the things that we were seeing is always asking the teacher instead of looking for the answer themselves. Lots of sloppy errors in formal writing. My students get hung up on one process to solve problems, particularly in math. My students ask me to make decisions for them, what topic to write, what books to read, etc. There's a tendency to give up when working on a difficult task instead of working to solve the problem. They depend on teachers for everything, and this needs to be altered. When taking tests, they don't always strive for accuracy when filling in blanks or transferring overwritten information into the test book.
Okay, so we've got the... We've got the... Yep, and I don't see them exactly, but what you're reading, certainly indicates that it's what we would have predicted, which is that what we see is that around the world, as we do this work, what we see is that all of those questions that you're raising, if we took all of those questions, which would be kind of a fun thing for us to do if we had time, but if we took all those questions and we put them in one column and we said, okay, these are the things that we see, and they're not really all questions, they're descriptions. And then if we said, what would be the positive behaviors that you would look for? What would you look for that would tell you, for example, when you see that your students are afraid to make mistakes, as a result, they do nothing. So what would you want them to do? And if you were to look at the habits of mind, I think you would begin to see that you would find that the habit of mind that looks at this question of communicating with clarity and precision, of being able to be flexible in your thinking. Some of my students are rushing to finish their work, not paying attention to details. One of the habits of mind, striving for accuracy. So if you look at any of the things that you put here, and you actually then looked at the list of the habits of mind, I believe what you would find is that it would be basically that the habits of mind describe some of what it is that we're looking for in our students. Art, do you want to add to any of that?
Well, yes, these habits of mind have been tested around the world, and it's very interesting that teachers have commented that this is exactly what they want their students to be, and it's the desirable behaviors that we want. We want kids to persist on tasks. We want kids to think before they act. We want kids to take risks. We want kids to be flexible in their thinking. We want kids to listen. And so these are the same behaviors that teachers want from their students in school, and they are the same kind of behaviors of successful people in many walks of life, and they are the kind of behaviors that will prepare students for the 21st century. So I think we have some pretty good reasons why we want to focus on these more enduring and essential dispositional kinds of learnings as the outcome of our curriculum.
So what we're going to do now is talk with you about how to make all of this operational, which is that when you're really talking about the idea that you want students to be more self-directed, here are some classroom examples from teachers who are working on that very question. Take, for example, this from Clovis Unified in California, where the teacher says, when the kids come in, I want to make sure that they know how to behave and they know what's expected in terms of when they're there, what they need to do, and when they're absent, what they need to do. So the teacher starts by saying, let's do a flow chart for when you're absent. So if you look at this, you'll see the teacher says, check your calendar and table of contents for missed work. In other words, the teacher is always putting forward, here's what we will be doing this week, these 2 weeks, this day. Check and see what you missed. If you missed a test or a quiz, then here's what you need to do. If you missed something in your homework assignment, here's what you need to do. So notice that what the teacher has done is set it up so that you have the flow chart for exactly what's expected of you when you return if you've been absent from class. How about, for example, this next one, where you would say, this is from Keith Whelan, who's at Clovis Unified School District in Clovis, California. And what he has done is he teaches chemistry. And so what he says is, okay, I know the chemistry standards, and I'm going to break them up into units of study. And so this is going to be the standards that are associated with gases and their properties. This is for students now. And so he has the students have the standard, which he's put down in user-friendly terms, in other words, the terms that he would be using in the classroom. And then he says, on this particular standard, define pressure and explain how it's related to the motion of particles. So he says, okay, tell me, student, do a little self-assessment. Are you ready for the test? If I ask questions about that, could you answer it? Do you need more practice? If you need more practice, then perhaps you need to go back and look at it, perhaps do some kind of a transfer of experience or experiment. Or don't you get it yet? Are you in a place where you really don't understand it? And what actions will you take? Which is, what actions are you prepared to take in order to be certain that you are going to get it and that you are going to have more practice? And then he has down at the bottom, list your evidence for your self-rating and what steps will you take to improve. Notice this one. Here's the next one, which is I think that's it. Oh, here's the one we missed. This one is a 6-week progress report. And what he does here is he has the students complete their own progress report. So that, in fact, they now talk about where are they, what points do they have, what points did they miss, what missing assignments do they have, how do you explain your grade? And that's part of what goes home to parents so that they can see exactly how the student is doing, not only from the teacher's perspective, but from his owning his own work and his own perspective on it. And finally, setting some goals so that they can actually see how he might improve. How about these from elementary school, Art?
Yes, evaluate kids. And we as teachers make rubrics, and we describe the rubrics in terms of what designates an expert or what designates a novice. But in this next slide, you will see how students can evaluate themselves. We have transformed the rubric statement into an I can. For example, here is a core competencies. I can read aloud by myself easily. I understand the books I read. Now, the intent of this is for students to judge for themselves. And they provide evidence by the books that they have read. I know how to read books and to read a variety of texts. I can predict and explain what will happen next in the story. We want students to anticipate outcomes, to look into the future, to see a trend in the story or a pattern, and to be able to predict what will happen. I can respond and give details when answering questions about a story. And so the students then is able to evaluate for themselves. So here is a rubric that is intended for students then to become self-evaluative. You can use rubrics that you have, but notice how we can change them into an I can statement, and therefore students can evaluate themselves. Let's go on to the next one. I can ask questions about the story I am reading. I can draw from past knowledge and make connections to the story. I can wonder about how the story tells me something more about myself. I can identify what the problem was for the main character. But look again at these objectives, because give them questions for the first one. Drawing on past knowledge and applying it to new situations for the second one. I can wonder about the story. In other words, we're asking students to use wonderment and awe. And I identify what the problem was for the main character. So there's problem solving again. In the next slide, this is looking at the habit of mind of listening with understanding and empathy. And we help students then evaluate themselves. I wait until someone has finished before I take my turn to speak. Don't you know? Adults who we wish we would do that as well. I show respect to contact and with the person who is speaking. show that I am listening by nodding, and I'm a good listener, and the students can evaluate themselves. In this next slide, you might want to try changing these into I can statements. I make connections between what you say and what the person directly before you said and before them. In other words, sometimes students have their own idea in mind, and they don't listen to the person who just spoke or the person before them. And so we want students then to build upon each other's ideas, to keep that idea in mind and to build upon it. This shows that they not only listen, but of course they respect and they understand each other's ideas, and they're trying to understand each other's ideas. So we can then use rubrics by translating them into I can statements and have students judge for themselves. And of course, if they are at the not yet level, or they are not performing that behavior too well, we want to help them then develop a plan of action for improving that competency and to even get better at it and make a conscious effort to set a goal for themselves.
There was a question about the slides, and someone has asked, I would like to have that chemistry slide, how can I do it? And I would suggest that you just go to the PowerPoint, download the PowerPoint from the ASCD webinar slide that they put up, download it, and then you can just blow up that slide and print it. It should not be a problem. So unfortunately, there was some not such good coordination between the slides and what we're saying. However, you'll be able to get the slides and you'll be able to do that. Now, what Art is talking about here is so important because basically what he's saying is that we're really concerned with the idea that students are able to, one, become more self-evaluative. If you're really interested in them becoming more self-directed, they also need to own the data of what takes place when they're doing their work. They need to be self-evaluative. They need to be data processors. They need to be able to consider what they're doing. They need to show the evidence of what they're doing. And they need to be able to think about, how am I going to get better at it? How am I going to get better at making connections between what is being said and what I'm thinking? How am I going to make connections that help me to ask better and more relevant questions? So we really are talking about self-direction, and we're talking about it as a series of goal setting, finding evidence of how you're doing with your goals, and being able to be self-assessing, self-monitoring in order to be able to see where you are with it. Here's another one, and this is from Julie Garardi when she was a second grade teacher. And so notice how she does this, because she doesn't just have the traditional, here's your reading log and write in what you're thinking about. Instead, she was influenced very much by Ellen Keene's work on Mosaic of Thought. And she said, okay, let me get them to think about these books, which is more than recall. So she says, this makes me wonder or ask a question. Notice how she's pushing for a sense of wonderment and questioning and problem posing. This is surprising. That's awesome, isn't it? It makes me curious. It makes me more innovative. This makes me make a prediction because I think that something will happen next. I'm anticipating as well as drawing from past knowledge. I love this part of the book. This gives me an idea. Notice how all of that is about getting students to do the work, and then she, of course, has at the bottom the idea of let's do it with text to text. That means let's look at this book and see how it relates to other books that we're reading. She does it with text to life, which is think about this book and think about what it is that leads me to something larger in the world. And then she also does it as text to applied knowledge, what I already know about and how I'm thinking about that. So notice how she's using this as a way to foster the habits of mind in relationship to literacy work, where she has them respond to a book. Now, all of this is a segue to really thinking about the significance of metacognition. And what Art and I have done is we've said the metacognitive staircase, the capacity to think about your thinking, to see how important it is to be conscious of what you are thinking, your thoughts and the thoughts of others. As you think about becoming self-directed, you're thinking about becoming more self-managing, meaning I'm planning more, self-monitoring, I'm paying attention to what I'm doing and seeing how my plan works, and self-modifying. I'm getting feedback about it, I'm learning how to assess it better, and therefore I make modifications. So let's just walk up this metacognitive staircase, becoming aware of my thinking by first naming the kind of thinking that I'm doing. Am I doing cause and effect? Am I doing prediction? What is it that I'm working on? Art, did you want to do thinking strategically?
Yes, your sound is cutting out on me. What we mean by thinking strategically is having more than just one thought process in mind. In other words, first I'm going to compare, and then I'm going to make an inference from that, and then I'm going to see what is significant about that inference, so I'm going to evaluate, so that it's not just one step of thinking, but rather is having a string or a strategy of thinking. And then the third step, of course, is how well is it working for me? So I'm monitoring it and evaluating whether this way of thinking is successful. Is it effective? Do I need to change it? And, of course, the next step is to apply thinking in the future. So when I'm confronted with conditions like this in the future, what kind of thinking do I need to do? And which kinds of thinking do I need to get better at? The intent of this metacognitive staircase is to help kids internalize these thought processes so that it's not you asking them the question, but rather it's them asking themselves the questions. What kind of thinking am I doing? What is my strategy? Is it working for me? How might I use it in the future? And what do I need to do to get better at it? However, to begin with, you need, as a teacher, you need to prompt students to use this staircase and to climb up it in a conscious way. And so the next slide shows some questions that you can ask students to cause them to climb the metacognitive staircase. And so the lowest level, the first tread on the staircase, of course, would be to ask them to describe what thinking they are doing. What's going on inside your head right now? What kind of thinking are you performing? And then at the next stage, what approaches might you apply? If this doesn't work for you, what might you do next? As you consider the steps of problem solving, where are you in that step? What questions are you asking yourself? And so these are the questions that help students think strategically. At the third step, you want students to evaluate the effectiveness of their thinking, so you might ask questions. How well did your strategy work for you? How do you know that your strategy is working? What has worked for you in the past, and what makes you think this is the best strategy for this situation? At the fourth step up, wanting students to apply their thinking, how might you do this thinking next time? As you anticipate similar problems in the future, what insights might you carry forth about this, how this thinking might apply in other situations? And what has worked for you in the past that you might draw upon? And then finally, at the fifth step, at the highest step, why is this important to you? What goals are you setting for yourself to become even more mindful about your thinking? And as you anticipate similar problems in the future, what insights might you carry forth about how to think through such problems? All of these questions are intended to help students climb this metacognitive staircase, but more importantly, is helping them to internalize these questions so that they will ask the questions of themselves. The intent here is that students are going to take charge of their own thinking without you prompting them.
Yeah,
so
I think
helping students then to internalize these thought processes and use them.
Yeah, I think we're now up to a place where we want to be able to ask questions.
And I'm seeing some coming through. So here's one. Some of my students are rushing to finish their work and not paying attention to details. They are more interested in who is done first. However, that has never been reinforced by staff. It's a race between students as if the person who's done first is better. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a question of a number of things. One is managing impulsivity, like how much can you kind of restrain yourself. If somehow or other you were able to get students to consider that their first draft is not their last draft, that they need to actually take their time. So the habits that we're looking for there are basically ones that say, are you able to, one, manage your impulsivity? Don't turn it in without thinking. And then two, striving for accuracy. Check before you turn it in. One of the things that a teacher does that I find very interesting and seems to work very well is that she says to the students, before you turn your work in, I want you to pair up with somebody else, and I want you to go over it together. So it's kind of like a peer editing before you turn it in, and make sure when you compare your work that you're comparing and you're seeing, are you getting the same answer? If not, if you don't agree, how can you change that? Now, I know that that doesn't work with your grading system necessarily, but it could certainly work with developing the habit of, what do I need to do before I turn work in? I need to compare, I need to make certain that I am monitoring for it, and I need to make certain that I've looked for quality. So maybe it's a matter of formative assessments that don't really look at the question of grading, but look at the question of, how can I begin to think more clearly about what I need to do? So I think that that's certainly one way of doing it.
Okay. We have a question about elementary students and habits of mind. Much of what you've talked about seems to be geared to high school. So how can we get, or how has this approach been effective with elementary age students?
All right. So now the question that was being asked was one of saying most of these seem secondary, and what about elementary? And I would say that the last batch that we showed you were all elementary. All the I can statements were elementary examples, and that reading journal was from a second grade teacher, where she was talking about what this book makes me wonder, what it makes me think about. There are many, many examples of where teachers are doing this with elementary students. And ASCD put out a wonderful toolkit that was written by Karen Boyes and Graham Watts, which is a Habits of Mind toolkit designed especially with a lot of different ideas for how to handle elementary school students in terms of teaching them, helping them build the capacity for this, and helping them to grow with it. They also wrote one for secondary students that ASCD has published as well. But all of those examples that we showed with ICANN are elementary examples. Other questions?
Yes. If I have students who do not feel like doing the task at hand, they act out impulsively with each other. How do I get them to get back on track?
Art, you want to try that one?
I'm sorry, ask the question again.
How do person is saying on track when they seem...
Yes, if you have students who do not feel like doing the task at hand and they act out impulsively with each other, how do I handle that and get them back on track?
Yes. I think it's very important to help students understand what these habits of mind are. And that means, first of all, teaching them the words, giving them the labels for the behavior of managing impulsivity. And by the way, young children love the words of the habits of mind. They think metacognition and managing impulsivity is a wonderful word. So first of all, teach them what the words are. And then secondly, teach them what it looks like and what it sounds like so that they are able to be aware of their own behavior. When you see them getting off task, that's the time to remind them, John, are you managing your impulsivity? John, are you persisting? So sometimes you have to remind them. And you're going to want students then to set some goals for themselves and saying, okay, the next time I hear myself being off task, the next time I hear myself saying I'm bored, the next time I hear myself saying I give up, that's the time when I need to remind myself of the habits of mind of persisting, of managing my impulsivity, and so on, so that they internalize these habits of mind and use them to monitor their own action. Over time, we should refrain from prompting them as teachers and instead get them to prompt themselves. So this is, when a kid gets off task, it's a wonderful opportunity to teach them what it means to persist, how to stay focused, and of course how to monitor their own behaviors and to set goals for themselves to improve.
Okay. We have another question.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Oh, I was going to toss out another question, but if you want to do follow-up to what Art said, I can wait.
No, I was looking at one that said student ownership of learning, use of rubrics, and reflection are all part of assessment for learning versus of learning. What are your thoughts about this? Excuse me, and clearly that's the category that we're in. We're thinking of it in two ways. We're thinking of it as assessment for learning, meaning what is it that you learn about yourself? How do you use this to modify and become better at what you're trying to do? That's the student ownership of learning and the use of rubrics and reflection. But in addition to that, we're suggesting it's assessment as learning, meaning that when you take the time to do this with your students, it is actually a learning event in and of itself. It's not just that you're assessing, but that you're using the assessment and the assessment data and the reflection all as a way of learning about how to become more self-directed in your learning. Interestingly enough, many people call these the soft skills, and yet I think we would suggest, as we said, in not only the tests that you're preparing kids for, but the tests of life, I would say that they may be the soft skills, but they'll be the skills that will get you through many, many situations, both in the workplace as well as not, when you have the kinds of habits that allow you to behave differently and have the attitudes and dispositions that are required to actually be more effective as learners. Because the challenge for all of us is that this is truly something we have to put attention to. We can't just expect it. It's not something that you can expect the kids will do just because we name it. We have to set goals around it. We have to give them feedback around it. As we said, we have to help them to become self-managing, self-modifying, and self-monitoring, so that we're really able to make certain that we're doing this as a way of learning. Why don't we just take one more and then we'll kind of close it.
Okay. Do the habits of mind work with students diagnosed with autism or ADHD?
You know, sometimes we give labels to kids that tend to classify them as gifted or autistic or some kind of deficit disorder. And I understand that. It helps us to deal with those kids. But what we'd like to do is to not label them so much as to look at their behaviors. And we find that many of those children are the ones who need to learn these habits of mind. We find kids who are impulsive. They blurt out in class. But that could be true of gifted kids as well as autistic kids, for example. We know that some kids lack persistence, but that's true of adults as well as kids. And so what we're going to suggest is that instead of labeling them, let's take a look at their habits and their behaviors through the filters of the habits of mind and find out which habits they need to learn. And that applies to all kids, whether they are labeled as gifted, slow, autistic, English language learners, or whatever it might be. And so let's focus on the behaviors that we want them to learn rather than the labels that we give them.
So we have an observation from Shirley. Shirley says, modeling these principles are a great start in getting our students to be self-directed, which is probably a very good segue to where we are right now. Because we ask the essential questions: what are the characteristics of effective, creative, successful 21st century problem solvers? Maybe we need to ask that of ourselves. What would be the characteristics that we need to have in order to be effective, creative, successful problem solvers? And how might we foster the habits for self-directed learning? We might ask ourselves as teachers or as administrators also, are we showing the behaviors of self-directed learning? In what ways do we develop these habits so that we're continuously modeling them? So as a result, we decided that maybe we needed to make a new commitment for this school year. Maybe our commitment is really one in which we say we are committed to starting this new school year by saying, 1, I will not rescue my students from learning. Meaning not that we're going to say, go cold turkey, play tough love. What we're saying is that when a student is struggling with something, we encourage them to learn how to continue to do the work and struggle with it rather than giving them the answer. that we learn how to ask some of those powerful questions to them that are coaching questions rather than rescue level questions, that we're really suggesting to them that they don't need to be rescued, they need to put themselves forward. What else might you try if this is not working? How else might you do this? What do you know from another situation that you might draw upon that would help you with this? Rather than saying, oh, you're having trouble? Well, here's what you need to do. Let me show you.
Another commitment that we'd like to make is to involve students in both self-evaluation and in goal setting. We know, for example, that kids who are involved in describing their own rubrics, kids who are involved in assessing themselves, kids who are involved in describing what it would look like, what it would sound like if they are successful, they are the ones who are self-evaluating, and they learn more, they achieve higher when they are involved in self-evaluation. It means we want kids to make a commitment to set some goals for themselves and to show the progress along the way in the achievement of those goals.
And then to be certain that students know that your purpose is to help them become curious, engaged, continuous, thoughtful learners, and that the content of the lesson serves as a vehicle for that learning process. In other words, for those of you who have been working with Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe on Understanding by Design, for those of you who have been developing units of study, for all of us who are working all the time on our lesson plans, let's think of it as the process is really what's important to us in relationship to the content. As we always say, there is no such thing as content in the absence of thinking about it. And there is no such thing as thinking in the absence of good content. How do we wed the two so that we're really helping our students to become more engaged, more thoughtful learners?
It means making a commitment to provide students with rich tasks that are going to involve them in creative and strategic planning. It means being able to work together in groups to solve some problems, to do some projects in which they're going to have to think strategically over a long period of time, to make a plan of action, to monitor that plan, and to reflect upon their thinking together. So I'm going to provide opportunities for rich learning experiences and then have students reflect on which of the habits of mind served them as they were engaging in these rich cognitive tasks and problem-solving activities. And remember that these habits of mind come forth in response to problems, the answers to which are not immediately known. And so try to ask kids questions and give them problems, the answers to which are not immediately known.
And this really brings us to what Shirley was calling for, which is modeling. Because I think we all need to make a commitment that I will model the behaviors I want my students to acquire. Now, that may sound like a comment on the obvious, but let me tell you, it's not so easy. It isn't so easy when you're frustrated by, for example, a bell ringing and you know you need to rush to get to the end. Are you going to rush to get to the end in the absence of being thoughtful about what it is that you want the students to do? Are you able to maintain a way of helping them to continually be engaged with what you're doing? For example, are you able to say, as that bell rings, instead of becoming impulsive about the bell ringing and becoming like, this is the end, how about if you said, you know, we really haven't finished what we're doing and we're going to figure out how together we're going to make time to address this tomorrow, and we're going to not rush to get it done because thinking takes time. And when I'm in the faculty meeting, am I going to be able to be a different kind of person in the faculty meeting? I don't have to love everybody in my faculty, but I do have to be curious and engaged and thoughtful about what they're saying. I do need to work in the world of ideas, not so much in the world of personalities. I need to be able to listen with understanding and empathy. I need to be able to be thinking flexibly and not be, it's my way or the highway. All of these things are things that we all have difficulty with. If these were not difficult, we wouldn't have to make such a point about them. But they are. They're hard for us as well as for the kids that we teach. But if we can't model those behaviors, if we can't manage ourselves, then why would we ever expect that the kids would behave any differently than the adults that they're surrounded by? So this year, when you make your commitment, think about these as a possible commitment. Think about the idea that you will really learn with your students about what it means to be thoroughly invested and engaged in the habits of mind. Bart, did you want to say anything more as an end?
Well, I think what Ben is saying is that what gives the curriculum dignity is that it is as good for the adults in the school as it is for the kids. And so we can all get better at our habits of mind. We can all become better listeners. We can all learn to manage our impulsivity. We can all strive for perfection.
I also wanted to point out that Habits of Mind and the Habits of Mind series are available in the ASCD store. You can go to shop.ascd.org to purchase them. And if you see on the screen now, we've got some resources for you. The Habits of Mind Institute website, the Habits of Mind Ning site, and eduplanet21.com are some additional places you can learn more about Habits of Mind. And again, thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again next time.